The trouble with taking the RAN software and putting it on general purpose processors is that some of the RAN software is really computationally demanding, and it doesn't work very well on general purpose processors. They're general purpose. They're not necessarily meant to do this
by
stuff.
definition.
Yeah, and so
tailor-made.
So people have been trying to find workarounds to overcome that problem, because if you don't overcome it, you're accepting that your virtualized
And let me just quickly butt in with one thing. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Only like 6 days since the last one. 6 days of relentlessly lovely weather.
It was a bit shit, wasn't it?
We had one day, actually reminds me of the Ashes.
Got rained off.
Well, one day the Ashes got mainly rained off, and then the final day, the morning got lost. And it was quite tight. Actually, give another shout out to Charlie Ashton, because he was saying, well done for mentioning the Ashes when he was talking about the last pod on LinkedIn. And gutted, Charlie? It looked like we were going to win it. But then fair play to the Aussies. There's nothing contentious. They just had a couple of late order batsmen who stuck around and got the job done, including their captain. Pierre's yawning.
Dear.
All right, well, I'll talk about the Petanque World Cup instead.
Exactly, that's the equivalent of... It's not a sport. Come on.
It's not a sport. How dare you, sir?
Come on, it's definitely a sport.
Has he been here too long for us to deport him? That's heresy, sir.
I'm offending a lot of people
That's
here.
terrible,
That should be one of the... There used to be a thing back in the 80s. There was quite a right-wing politician called Norman Tebbit who had some kind of cricket test, like talking about, I don't know, immigrants from Pakistan or India, how they got to support the English cricket team. I think we should apply that to French people as well.
Yeah.
He's got to at least pretend to be into cricket to be allowed to stay in the country.
I would leave before I have to do that.
I'd sooner leave. Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, we just lost, but fair play to the Aussies. And it's set up to be a top series. I'll leave it there, right? All right?
When's the next test?
No, I can't talk about it anymore. He'll start making snoring noises. About a week and a half. Right. We haven't been out and about today, and we've probably only got about an hour and a half to get this pod done. So I'm going to keep the talking shit to a minimum, and just sort of crack on with it, really. It's just us, again. We're sort of run out of guests for the time being.
Well, it's summer, isn't it?
We had a pretty good run, though. I think first half of this year, we had more guests than not, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we could get them on if we wanted, but, you know...
Yeah, I've got one PR agency trying to get me to get some Nokia people on.
Uh-huh.
But, you know, they go, oh, we got this bloke who's based in the States. I went, nah, he's got to come to studio. And they went, oh.
There might be an option of getting some HPE people on.
Oh, yeah. That's still...
Speak with them about that. But,
yeah. After you've gone to the lane.
Next week, I think. Yeah. Forgot about that.
You're going to... We're allowed to say that. There's nothing embargoed about it, is it?
The actual...
You can't just say what it's about.
I can't... Yeah, I'm not even sure I know what it's about anyway, but there is an event they're doing up at the Lane.
Yeah, or what's it called now? I'm a Spurs fan, I should know. What's Spurs Stadium called, Pierre?
White Hart Lane?
It's still called White Hart Lane? It's not called, like, I don't know, Nescafe Stadium or whatever, whoever sponsored it.
Foot Locker Stadium.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, why don't I just get on with it? What are we going to talk about this week?
Well, maybe it's... Okay, I'll investigate. Yeah.
Okay, you'll investigate. Did you want to talk about who's been listening to the pod, or was that for another time, Pierre?
No, for next week, yeah.
Oh, okay. We are going to... Last week we spoke about Huawei in the context of Europe adopting a sort of what seemed like a much stronger stance.
So it's boringly called Tottenham Hotspur Stadium.
Just that.
Yeah.
So that's basically
like
pending
that.
a sponsor, isn't it?
I think that's much better. Why can't they all just call this?
Knowing the bloke who runs Spurs is called Daniel Levy, and he likes money, and it's called that because he hasn't got enough money off a sponsor yet.
I like money.
Yeah.
I just don't have any.
Yeah. I mean, I think Spurs are going to be shit next season. One of the reasons is we haven't been bought by someone principally from the Middle East. That's one tangent we went off on last week.
Yeah.
When I was worried about getting in trouble with MBS. How they bought the Gulf. And now Pierre was just lamenting, Pierre's an Arsenal fan, and how the transfer market's gone mental because Saudi Arabia's just like buying players now. They're a major part of the football transfer market now.
I think this Middle East sort of, Gulf states buying these top teams I'm not sure I'm a big fan of it, really. Although, having said that, if someone came along and bought Blackburn and pumped loads of money in and turned them into a Premier winning side again, I'd be very happy about it, obviously.
Well,
That's the issue, yeah.
someone did about 30 years ago, and all it took was like an English entrepreneur.
That was Jack Walker.
Yeah.
He was like a local
local
Yeah.
boy come good. Now you got to be Saudi or...
They're owned by an Indian company
Because you're not allowed...
Venky's at the
Can't be
moment.
bought by Russians anymore.
No.
I always thought that was a funny thing, actually. When Saudi Arabia bought Newcastle, there's a little bit of muttering, but this is at the same time where Roman Abramovich had been forced to divest Chelsea.
Yeah.
And all the superficial posturing as well, because they're baddies. But then, we know, as we said last week, that Saudi Arabia, it hasn't got a spotless fucking record.
Who runs it?
Who what?
Who runs Saudi Arabia?
Mohammed bin Salman,
What
MBS.
does he get up to in his spare time?
Well, I've heard you don't want to be a journalist taking a piss out of him. Let's just put it that way. But there's loads of places that are dodgy. I'm just wondering who I want to buy Spurs. What country do I want to buy Spurs? I mean, who is one of the reasons the Saudis got so much money?
Norway?
Is the cost of energy since the Ukraine thing.
Norway could use its massive pot of money that it gets.
That's got a big sovereign wealth fund, doesn't it?
Why doesn't Norway use its big sovereign wealth fund to buy?
Because that would be a terrible investment.
Yeah, exactly. It's a shit investment. You only invest in a football club if you don't give a toss. If you've got so much money, you're like, whatever. I'll buy the moon next. You watch. So yeah, we need someone with just reckless amounts of money, and we'll overlook any amount of journalistic dissection.
Yeah,
if it means that we do slightly better at football. So there we go. That's my moral threshold. Is will we do a bit better at football? Will I be able to go up to Pierre and go ha in a few years' time when we do a bit better than
that
Arsenal?
seems to be the world's moral threshold at the moment.
It is a bit. Yeah, everyone has their price. Anyway, having said I won't go off on a tangent, there was one. So yeah, we chatted about Huawei last week and Europe apparently getting a bit tougher with them, but I think our conclusion was that it still seemed a bit vague and a bit, I don't know, inconclusive what they were saying. But one of the things I certainly speculated about in my piece is, sooner or later it's going to come to a head between them and Germany, which is the country, certainly the big country that's still got the biggest install base of Huawei kit. And you followed up with reporting on some comments that their CEO made. Yeah. Basically along the lines of, we'll do what we fucking want.
Well, he was at an event that I got notified about that was run by I don't know their proper name in Germany.
Well, I was just
go on.
Get into that in a sec. I'm just going to go over quickly. Other than to say that I keep forgetting, but I'm trying to make myself do it. There's a few bits of housekeeping that I never do anymore, and I'm trying to remember to do. One is to say that it's Scott Chainer from Telecoms.com with Ian from Light Reading and Pierre from France.
Yeah.
And the other one is I've forgotten to say for weeks is if you're watching this on the site or on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also listen to it on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and loads of other platforms.
I like that intro. I think you should always do that.
I know, I just forget.
From France bit.
Oh, Pierre from France, yeah.
But they know who we are, don't they?
The reason I said it last week, the reason is because Telecoms.com and Light Reading are completely independent of each other, and it seems only fair, given that Ian's kind enough to give me an afternoon a week of his time. For which there are no incentives along the lines of beer.
So I get to drink beer.
And you as well, Pierre. I think it's only fair to acknowledge you, that's all. Given that the branding's all mine or my site's. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to talk about that, and I'll hand back to you in a sec on that, Ian. And then I think we're going to follow up. This is actually it's appropriate that I'm giving you a shout out because most of the stories are based on your writing rather than mine this week. Although we both wrote this up, but you went in much more depth. Nokia did a bunch of launches this week, a lot of which were centred around its silicon.
Yeah.
And you've made a point over the last few years of getting really elbows deep in that stuff, and you interviewed one of their guys, and so you've got lots of insight to offer on that. So one of those ones that you sometimes sidestep, and understandably, because when you get into like VRAN and that stuff, it gets very technical.
It does, yeah.
But it is also very relevant.
Yeah.
So I think it's fine for us to chat about it every now and then. And then I've got more. My superficial headline was Nokia launches loads of baseband cards. That was about it. And then we're going to finish up with a bit more of a Scott Chainer self-indulgent one, talking about AI. I wrote a thing about sort of regulation of AI, and I think there's some fun tangents to be gone off on just, I will joke about the Terminator stuff, and that's still a distant threat, but there are much more immediate concerns to do with AI, some of which these regulators claim to be addressing, but I wonder if they are. So that's what we're going to get into there.
Yeah.
So yeah, Ian, back to you. You said that you were you dialed into it.
Yeah, I dialed into. I got notified that he was speaking at this event in Germany, run by.
This is who? Just repeat who it is again.
This is Timotheus Hertges. So he's the. I don't know if that's how it's pronounced, by the way.
It's
that's my
better effort than I could manage,
because it's one of those. The surname's H-O with an umlaut over it, which I think softens the O, doesn't it? Hurt.
Beats the hell out of me.
Anyway. He's the boss of Deutsche Telekom, and he was on a panel basically at this event in Germany, run by, and I don't know their name in German, but it translates as the Federation of German Industries.
Right. One of those 20-letter words.
Yeah, I mean, the panel that he was on was they had him next to the CEO of Deutsche Bank, and he was
all the Deutsches were there,
and then there was another like top German company. I can't remember who it was with the kind of top executive there. I mean, I was pretty much obviously focused on what he had to say as opposed to the others. But
Deutsche Bank was just going, yeah, it's been a rough year.
Well, the theme of the event was not about Huawei. It was very much about Europe and how does Europe compete in the world these days, and are we losing out to the US and Asia? There's all these concerns about competitiveness
or the geopolitical trade.
Yeah, and a lot of his comments are actually he's really anti. I wouldn't say he's anti-European. That's maybe unfair, but he's very sort of frustrated by European rules and regulations, clearly, Timotheus Hertges. And he made out this move that they'd done a few years ago when they decided to go big on America and, up their investments there and be a part of this merger with Sprint, and try and get that done. And then they've increased their stakes into there, so now they're the majority owner of
the majority owner of the new
team of the US.
Did they buy some more off SoftBank? Would it be one of those staggered divestment type of thing?
They were already the biggest shareholder anyway, but they.
It sounds like SoftBank needs all the investment wins it can get at the moment.
Yeah, they're now kind of in control, and it's and that's been a massive success for them. Obviously, that's been it's quite interesting looking at T-Mobile. You look at telco's share prices and what they've done over the last 5 years, and it's normally like that. It's like a downward slope. And I was really stunned actually looking at it because I didn't think it would be up as much as it is. It's up like something like in the last 5 years, 4 or 5, it's up 227%.
What metric is this?
T-Mobile share price.
Right, Deutsche Telekom.
No,
T-Mobile is listed separately. Oh, right. Okay.
On the
I should have known that.
Exchange. Yeah.
Right, a COD. That is a lot.
Yeah.
So basically that Sprint thing's fucking paid off.
So over that same period, AT&T's down 43%, 40-something%, mid-40s.
Well, they just keep dicking about
and
with
Verizon's
telly and
down
stuff.
23%.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the only other player at the moment, obviously, in that market is Dish, which is
having
struggling.
A tricky time of it.
I mean, I might come back onto some of that stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Because you want to talk about AI later. And I think
okay. So you got...
But the Huawei stuff, he got asked, as you would expect, which is kind of why I dialed into it, because this EU stuff that we were talking about last week, trying to sort of tighten up the rules and be a bit sort of tougher on Chinese suppliers, and Germany's all in on Chinese electronics, and that's very true of the telecom operators there. They've kind of used Huawei a lot. Each of the companies, actually, each of the three main operators has relied heavily on Huawei equipment. And John Strand, who we refer to a lot on this podcast, but Strand Consult did an excellent report, I think, on just looking at all the operators in Europe and how kind of reliant they were on Chinese suppliers. And his report pointed out, he did one on 4G years ago that showed that 57%, I think it is, of German equipment came from German sort of 4G RAN equipment came from Chinese companies, really meaning Huawei. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of carried on that percentage into the 5G world. So while other countries were stepping back a little bit, mainly the UK, I'd say, but some of the Scandinavian ones were sort of quite rigorous.
Well, as I think we said last week, it would have been sensible to read the writing on the wall and get ahead of regulation and law and just be like, look, it's probably safer to just go with Ericsson and Nokia and whoever else.
Totally. That's a criticism.
But the Germans haven't done that.
Well, they haven't done that. And so he got asked about this, about, I can't remember the woman who was leading the panel. She's obviously a journalist. She asked questions in a really good way, actually, but she sort of tried to put him on the spot on that, and what's happening. And his response is basically As far as we're concerned, and as far as German law is concerned, the antennas themselves, the radio access network equipment, isn't considered a critical element. And
which is the move we tried about 2 or 3 years ago.
Totally. And he was saying, and you might as well say, by the way, any smartphone could be regarded as is also an antenna, and therefore if you're going to start making rules and regulations about radio access network equipment, why not extend it to devices as well?
Well, to an extent with Huawei, we have indirectly by Google withholding Android from them, which they haven't done to the best of my knowledge. I don't know if they've done it to ZTE. They certainly haven't done it to Xiaomi.
No, they haven't.
They haven't done it to Oppo. I mean, my house, apart from my phone, my house is all Chinese. They're all OnePlus and Oppo in my house because they're the best value mid-range smartphones. I don't believe in spending too much money on my family except me.
And then he basically said, these weren't his exact words, but he said, look, if Germany decides that this is what it's going to do and it's going to ban Huawei and tighten things up, then fine, we'll comply with that. But he's not
going to come out and say fuck German law.
So clearly they're not going to do anything unless they are compelled to by Germany's national government. And I think the hope of the EU actually, and people who were quite supportive of this move, like John, who we just mentioned, John Strand, was that the sort of edict they came out with last week or the week before, or whenever it was, but would compel operators to just sort of act of their own accord and go, well, hang on a minute, because one thing they did say, which you pointed out, was, I thought it was a bit weak, but then your point was good, I think, that you don't want to be in the EC's bad books, was the EC saying, well, we're not actually going to have dealings with these companies that are still using Huawei.
I think there's a lot of from them. There's a lot of, there's a cliche that says, speak quietly and hold a big stick. I think that's typical of the EU's approach. Yeah. They very rarely go, oi, fucking do what you're told. They just go, no, do what you want, but,
be warned.
It's sort of, I think we've compared it before, slightly mafia-ish, nice business you got there, shame if anything happened to it type of thing. And they do have it within their power to say that you can't directly interact with any of our many tentacles. But I think what they're really doing is they were trying to put pressure on countries to then put pressure on their operators. Is that how you understand it?
I think they were trying to put pressure on countries to put pressure on their operators, but I think there was also a hope that the operators themselves might just decide. This is where I'll be a bit critical of, and you just alluded to this, I think, anyway, that these telcos the telcos that haven't done anything. And would maybe justify not having done anything on the basis of, well, our government allows us to do that.
Yeah.
If you're, maybe they should have seen the writing on the wall, basically. Maybe they should have done a bit of risk planning and gone, well, hang on a minute, at some point things are going to get really nasty. We're going to come under pressure from the EC, even if our government hasn't done anything. And it's just going to make things really awkward for us, and there's reputational consequences. Not to mention the fact, by the way, that Huawei's not in, from some people's perspective, Huawei's not in the greatest position at the moment anyway, because of the US sanctions.
Of course.
That has made it very hard for it to, you can see areas, very noticeable areas, where it's really hurt it badly, and that's most visible clearly on the smartphone side. Where their smartphones aren't competitive anymore.
It's funny, isn't it? For all the bans on their equipment in networks, it's just been the simple Google withholding Android that's probably been the most significant move. It
has, but here's the interesting thing. So, and this is a bit of a segue that maybe should come later, because we're going to talk about this later, but we can come back to it. But one of the points about Nokia's latest stuff that it's announced, and this was already kind of... they'd sort of hinted at some of these things anyway back at MWC. I just think the whole rebranding, the new logo overshadowed what they were saying actually on some of the radio stuff. But these products that they're coming out with now, some of them, so Habrock's they're all named after birds of prey.
Yeah.
But the Habrock base station,
but not ones that you've heard of.
Not ones that you've heard of. Yeah, really obscure birds of prey.
They all basically sound like people out of Vikings that I've been watching.
Totally. Yeah.
Was it Ragnar Lothbrok?
Yeah. There was one called Shikra, which sounds like some kind of Hindu god, I think.
Yeah.
But the Habrock stuff. So I spoke with Tommy Wheater, who's like the head of the whole mobile business unit at Nokia, back in February at Mobile World Congress, and he was saying the chips they use in that And he was saying both in the sort of radio units and in the kind of on the baseband side as well. They're using 5 nanometer technology now in those products. Now,
it's about the latest. Have we got down to 3 in terms? Are they producing?
I don't
3
think they're
nanometer
producing
chips
3 at the moment.
Right.
But you're basically talking about if you're trying to get 5 nanometer chips, there's only a couple of places you can go for it.
TSMC
and Samsung.
Yeah, not
And neither of those,
companies.
because of the US sanctions, neither of those companies can sell to Huawei anymore.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Tommy Wiseau is one of those guys that you speak to and he just sort of comes out with stuff and doesn't seem to worry about.
Nokia, get him on. Get Tommy on the pod.
Wait, yeah, that'd be brilliant to get him on. But he basically said...
First thing I'll say is, did you used to work on the docks? I wonder if he gets the Bon Jovi reference.
But he was very prepared to sort of have a dig at his big Chinese rival and say, their products will not be as competitive in the future if they can't get access to those chips because, and for the reasons that so we were both on the call with Mark Atkinson, who works for him, who's head of their radio access network stuff.
That's it.
So it's a subset of what he does. He was saying when he was talking about these chips that basically. It's just more power efficient. You get all sorts of performance advantages. You get all those things carrying through that you would.
No, I think that's a given. I mean, I think we've understood when we had that sort of chip crunch, the knock-on effects to the global economy was profound, like cars and stuff.
But this is one of the curious things I find about Germany's operators that haven't moved away from Huawei is, if I was a CTO in those companies, I'd have been going, well, hang on a minute, in the future. Now they've done some stockpiling and maybe they've found some loopholes in play. That I know there's lots of loopholes that have been exploited in terms of them trying to get hold of things. They built up a lot of inventory when I think they saw this coming. They've done things with software to try and get the most out of the products they're developing. There's God knows how many smartphones sold every year, a lot fewer base stations, so it's much easier to keep that base station business going with a smaller pile of chips, arguably, as well.
Right.
So there's various reasons why they maybe not had to worry about it so much, but at some point it's going to have some knock-on effect on their product competitiveness unless they can find domestic solutions. And if you talk to all the experts, they say it's not an easy thing to fix. It's
China's presumably lobbing money at it, but you just can't.
It's just really hard to do. You need companies like ASML is a really good example of an important company in the mix. It's Dutch.
Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Dutch EU does something called extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is basically sort
process you need for these
shining beams of light to sort of print circuits onto
and
silicon.
You kind of the further down you go in terms of the node, the more that kind of technology is important, isn't it?
You need that, and it's incredibly hard to develop. I mean, I read a really interesting book on it actually, a book called Chip War by a guy called Chris Miller, who's who sort of wrote a whole chapter just on ASML in a really interesting way, kind of brought it to life about how that company became what it is. And it's basically got a monopoly in that market. They have 100% share of the market for EUV at the moment.
Which is bizarre, isn't it?
If you read the book, it's a very good... I mean, this is the thing that these monopolies come about very quickly, almost accidentally, and before you know it, that's happened. And
yet in
it's
hindsight...
not like anybody's engineered it.
And yet in hindsight... I mean, I can't believe that some people like the geezer who created TSMC or the people running Intel or whatever can't have imagined sometime in the past that this EUV lithography would become...
TSMC is heavily involved with ASML.
Yeah,
so,
I bet.
And I think they've been supportive of them and maybe even provided funding. I'd have to check on that, but they're one of the... They've had a lot of people behind ASML's development of this stuff that are players in the chip industry, Intel included. I mean, going back to the Huawei thing, this is the thing. Is as I say, if you were Deutsche Telekom, if you were Timotheus Herges and you were speaking to your CTO and saying, isn't there going to be some impact in the future? And presumably he's saying, yes, there is. Then aren't you yourself thinking we need to start planning for a post-Huawei kind of period of our existence? And given all the kind of political pressure at the moment that's coming, shouldn't we be trying to do that? And yet he seems quite resistant to doing it. Now, the other reason he gave, which brings us on to that tweet that you might refer to.
Oh yeah, let me cue it up. So the thing that flagged this up to me is there's a bloke called Michael Kovrig, and he retweeted your account of what you've just been describing.
He did.
Now, the reason Michael Kovrig is especially poignant in this is, listeners who pay close attention to the telecoms industry might have been aware that for a while America was trying to extradite Huawei's CFO and daughter of its founder, who's called
Meng Wanzhou.
Meng Wanzhou, thank
I don't know
you.
if that's how it's pronounced, but
You saved me from mangling the Chinese pronunciation. And she was under house arrest in Canada while this process played out, and in the end they didn't succeed and she went back home. Anyway, part of that process, which took about a couple of years to play out,
I think 3 altogether.
right, is China halfway through. This is one of the reasons I only half joke about being nervous about going to China, but not because I think China gives a toss about me individually, but when you've got these superpowers having pissing competitions with each other, collateral damage happens.
Yeah.
And so they basically arrested a couple of Canadians, I think.
Yeah.
And when, wow, not so nice when some of your fuckers get arrested, is it? Two Michaels. And one of them was called Michael Kovrig. And, maybe it's just bias, but I don't think they had anything on them. I think it was, they'd had the usual thing, a bit like what happened to like Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in Iran. They just went, well, he was spying, wasn't he?
Yeah. By the way, I don't think they had... Meng Wanzhou had a house in Vancouver that looks quite luxurious, and she was able to sort of move around.
You're saying
Vancouver.
her house arrest could have been
Well,
worse.
her house arrest wasn't even a house arrest. She had, I think, by all accounts, she had like an ankle bracelet, I think, equivalent of, and she was able to move around her local area and go to Starbucks and do things. What she couldn't do was
That's
go
fine.
back
She
to,
could put little stickers on it, little bits of bling,
she could do that.
accessorise.
She couldn't go back to China and see her family and things like that. So it wasn't ideal, but she was... By all accounts, these guys were kept in sort of 2x2 metre cells.
Right. Well, so I think you mentioned before we started recording that this guy we're talking about is writing a book on his experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a bit of a piss take, and it seemed very tit for tat. And then what seemed to confirm it is as soon as Meng was let off, suddenly they went, oh yeah, they weren't spies after all, and let them come home.
Yeah.
And anyway, so this guy's retweeted your story, and I'll read out what he said. He said, DT's Hutgus worries that ending the use of Huawei equipment for national security reasons could result in China retaliating against German companies, which is something you haven't mentioned. So, let me just finish the last thing he said. And then he asked the question, is fear of punishment a sensible, virtuous or courageous basis for doing business? Now, by him begging the question, he seems to be saying it's not, but I think it is a good question.
It's a good question. So that came because Hutgus said this was his other sort of reason. He didn't want to do it, obviously, because he's basically said we're not going to do it unless there's German laws that stop us from doing it, because it's not considered critical elements, which we can talk about that whether they are or not. But then he went on to say, this is his exact quote, I believe that it is not a wise recommendation because we should manage the interdependencies of industries. I just believe that banning an antenna would have consequences for other industries sitting here, maybe in the room, which are trying to sell their products into China.
Well, totally.
I mean, that's pretty
Beamers.
blunt.
Were Beamers in the room?
Beamers, I mean, the whole thing was organised by the Federation of German Industries, so I'm guessing they were machine tools, car parts.
I mean, we know Germany is one of the major exporters in the world, and China is one of the, if not the biggest market in the world.
Yeah, and also I think there was a statement that went out from the German Foreign Ministry back in April that I got hold of, basically saying that China last year was their biggest trade partner, I think, even the biggest. And they put the volume of trade at something like 300 billion euros. So,
and I don't think we've ever heard Merkel or whoever's in charge of Germany now ever say anything combative towards China. Olaf Scholz.
Scholz.
They've always sat on the fence, haven't they?
I think he's come in and had to sort of pick up the pieces of what she sort of, the mess that she sort of created, really. Because,
right.
I mean, it wouldn't have seemed like a mess when she was in power, but then she's gone, and very quickly we've ended up in this kind of slight geopolitical nightmare.
Turns out she was shitter than anyone thought at the time.
Russia's invaded Ukraine, and all of a sudden it's not a good idea to get your gas from Russia anyway. You can't anyway because they've been squeezing.
And she was the one who, I think, back in 2015, just opened the borders and created all kinds of migrant crisis.
Yeah.
So there's some weird, I mean, reckless. And I'm not saying, obviously, I don't want to start to go down the rabbit hole of immigration policy, but she just seems to do some quite absolute policies rather than just go, all right, we'll let a few more in. You know, they're having a nightmare in Syria, we'll let some of them in.
Yeah.
She just sort of seemed to open the gate and went,
she did.
Bring it on.
Yeah.
Which seems reckless.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe this is a bigger reason for him digging his heels in, and obviously the German government themselves not wanting to do anything, is this trade concern. Because the cost of doing it, if you look at a Barclays research note that I managed to get hold of for Deutsche Telekom, I think this is a bit conservative, to be honest with you, based on my own sort of thoughts about it. But yeah, but
spreadsheetage.
Yeah, they reckon it would cost about 1.1 billion for Deutsche Telekom to take out.
Yeah,
the whole cost for Germany, by the way, if you include Vodafone and Telefonica as well, they put it about 2.5 billion.
Right.
Now that's not a massive.
And is this a cost? Sorry, because we need to. I think, God, years ago when we were first talking about this, I think again, Strandy, who we'll keep giving you a shout out until we've drunk all your beers, John, and then you don't get a shout out.
He's been the guy who's been all over this.
It's not just because he gave us beer. I'm only joking. But when the talk of swap outs first came up, I think it was him that alerted me to the important distinction between swapping out at a point of natural obsolescence,
yes,
and swapping out prematurely.
Yeah.
And so obviously, because I think there were some UK companies, maybe BT especially, were going on about how much it's going to cost them, and he was going, no, that's bullshit. You're just going to swap it out when you would have bought new kit anyway.
And then he turned out to be right, because they basically pivoted once they had to do it and said the same thing as him. And they basically said it was actually only going to cost us 500 million, and we could.
Much so it pains me to say John was right on something. So that's it. So those calculations you're talking about there, they're predicated on some kind of premature swap out rather than natural end of life.
Yeah, I mean, so the situation the UK was in back then was that it was only just starting to build out 5G kit, and a lot of the 4G kit that had been installed was quite old by then and actually needed replacing anyway. So it was a natural time in the cycle to do a big refresh and put in loads of new stuff. Whereas we're not in that position at the moment in Germany.
Germany were going to do that. They should have done that 5 years ago.
This is the other thing. They've not been slow on their 5G rollout, according to them. If you go into their earnings statements and their annual report, Deutsche Telekom now claims to have its 5G network across 95% of the population. They've got, I'll give you the exact figures, they've got 24,000 sites where it's installed. And this is 5G, by the way, not Huawei. 24,000 sites and 80,000 antennas. Now, if you extrapolate John's percentage of 59% of 5G kit onto those numbers, you get, I can't remember what it is, did work it out in the story, but quite high figures, basically. Maybe I can just bring them up. But you're talking, I didn't write it down, but you're talking a lot of equipment that's Chinese, essentially, anyway. Here it is. Yeah, that would imply 14,160 sites in Deutsche Telekom's network that are Huawei equipped, and 47,200 antennas that have come from Huawei.
Right.
By the way, no one's ever repudiated those figures that he's put, and I think they were even cited by the Chinese ambassador recently when he was sort of grumbling about the EU having a go at Huawei. So, let's just see it. Barclays also has its own estimates, whether they're based on stuff that John's done previously, I don't know, but they put the figure in the 50s. So we're talking about a huge amount of equipment that needs to go. And that's why I think it could cost more than 1.1 billion, actually, if you look at what site costs can be and antenna costs.
And, if it came down to it, and either the EU or the German government started saying, right, you've got to do this. Yeah. Then presumably the first thing that DT says is, all right, chuck us a bill, and we'll get right on it.
So apparently they couldn't do that because of state aid rules.
Right, state aid rules.
So they'd have to they have to do it themselves. They'd have to pay for it. So this is the thing, like 2.5 billion for a national government to bear the cost of that. Consider in the context of $300 billion worth of or euros worth of trade with China and what governments spend annually on all sorts of things. I mean, what does the UK government spend? 800 billion or something on?
Well, how much do we spend just on keeping people out of work during lockdown?
Totally,
we can find the cash.
It's nothing. So, but for companies that are regularly complaining about how hard up they are these days, and there's no sales growth, and their costs are going up because of 5G traffic, and they don't cover their cost of capital, and blah-de-blah-de-blah, and all the other things they moan about, and they're quite heavily indebted and all this. So there's this general state of European telcos, not necessarily Deutsche Telekom, but it's not an insignificant amount to spend. So if they had to do it quickly, it would be costly and disruptive. It would probably have an impact on the share price,
Well, one thing about the EU is it doesn't tend to operate quickly.
Yeah.
So even if here's a ratcheting up from its position of 3 years ago, and then we can expect it to ratchet up again in about a year. But everything takes so fucking long that they can start to price some of that into it, and if they're sensible, when natural obsolescence does come up, maybe start swapping out.
This is the thing. I don't think this situation is gonna change very quickly, because the best case scenario that Barclays foresees in its research now is a gradual replacement of the kind that's been implemented
Organic.
in the UK.
Yeah,
because remember when the UK did this in 2020, as we've just been saying, there was not a lot of 5G kit installed at the time, and things were due for replacement, and yet they gave operators till the end of 2027 to finally remove Huawei equipment. 7 years, 8 years. It's a huge amount of time. You're basically talking about Huawei being in the network.
And that's where I find some of these sort of security/espionage claims a little bit weak. Because are we saying it's all right?
So concerned they're going to be spying there on us most of the 2020s
in that time?
Totally.
Or do we just have to not have any secrets till then, and then we can suddenly spill them all?
And the idea was, the reason they did that, I mean, they had these parliamentary sessions I remember listening in on, where people like Howard Watson that we meet from time to time, BT's CTO. Well, his job title is a bit different from that now, but that's basically what he is.
It's just overall
Chief Security and something.
Chief Geek.
He was saying,
I won't get him on the pod, will it? If I start saying, I never mean geek as a pejorative.
Nerd's the friendlier one, I think.
Geek, geek in the States is said with an affection. Yeah. I mean, it definitely talks to a sort of bespectacled, sort of computery kind of person.
Yeah.
But weeb is a bit more
maybe semi in that category sometimes, I think. Anyway, so but he basically was at these parliamentary sessions saying, if we do it quickly, it will be disruptive and it will be costly, and therefore the government, I think, went away and thought about it and came back and went, okay, then let's do it by the end of 2027. I can't see how Germany's government would fall, given the fact that 5G is now, according to Deutsche Telekom, at 95% coverage of the population, is going to come along and go, you need to get rid of all of this and do it in a few months, by the way.
Which leads up to the tension that I've alluded to a few times before. And, I won't mention who it is, but Herkes isn't the first senior member of a European telco from whom I've got the vibe that they think that the EU sometimes fucking sticks its neck out a bit too far and gets a bit too cheeky.
Yeah.
You remember we heard this anecdotal story about one EU commissioner being fairly assertive towards the CEO of a major European telco.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, that's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't see it going the other way. Couldn't see that CEO going, oi, Commissioner, fucking mind your P's and Q's.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just find myself naturally fascinated by power dynamics, just because, and I'm going to come up, this is a major sub-theme of the AI stuff that I want to talk about. Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's slightly relevant. There's one school of thought, which is a sort of Marxist kind of school of thought, where they think all human interactions are determined by power dynamics, which is obviously bollocks. Like, take this room. There are no power dynamics in this room whatsoever. There's no coercion, there's no force, there's no hierarchy, there's nothing. There's just three people who choose to spend their time doing this, partly because it's a bit of a laugh and we still get paid for it.
Yeah.
But partly just because we like doing it.
Yeah.
But there's no power dynamics involved. But I think once you get further up the food chain, necessarily to more powerful people and more powerful institutions, then the power dynamics start to kick in a little bit more. And so I find the power dynamics, and that was one of the big reasons that I was a leaver in Brexit. I didn't like the power dynamics going on with the EU, especially as they're unaccountable. Ursula von der Leyen wasn't voted in. There was barely even a vote within the inner party, to use a sort of vaguely Orwellian term. She was basically just shoehorned in by whatever people, Martin Selmayr, whatever, behind the scenes, who are the real puppet masters. And yet their power grows and grows and grows. The proportion of a country's legislation that's determined by them grows. And we're seeing here examples of them being quite forceful towards even the largest country in the bloc.
It's a really interesting point, because I wonder whether this is the reason why they've not been, I was saying to John Strand on the phone when I've chatted with him about this, why haven't they come in and been a bit more forceful and gone, you need to get done what the UK government did and say you need to get Huawei out by the end of 2029. You need to be down at 35% by 2025 or whatever. And maybe it's that we've seen this clash and CEOs not being happy necessarily with the conversations they've had with senior EU officials, and
testing the boundaries.
Himself sounding actually really pissed off about the EU,
and he's not the first.
Not necessarily just to do with this Huawei thing, but on other matters.
Mind your own business.
You come along and start being this sort of aggressive, and this perception that they're unelected officials who've come along and taken power and controlling things from beside the scenes is just going to be even stronger, isn't it? So,
I mean, who are you to tell me what to do?
So maybe this is why they're trying to go about it in a softly way. But the trouble then is maybe nothing will happen.
But I also get the impression that they're constantly testing the boundaries, because this happens with any bureaucracy. It's always going to grow. It's not necessarily a malevolent thing. But organisations are always going to grow. All the incentives are towards their growth. All the incentives for each individual. If I have 2 direct reports and have some kind of salary that's commensurate to that. If I had 10 direct reports, I'd probably have more cash, wouldn't I?
Yeah.
So there's an incentive structure built into growing the size of a group anyway.
Yeah, totally.
So there's all sorts of incentives in there, not necessarily malign ones, they're just there. And I think I get the impression that certainly in the context that we know about, Europe's just prodding and seeing how much it can get away with, how much coercion it can do. And how much governments and big companies will put up with. Because the other thing, of course, they have to be careful of is they're all interdependent.
Yeah.
Europe, in its essence, is a very fragile thing, because they have an economic and a currency union without a strong political union. I mean, the proportion of national sort of total tax intake that gets paid to the EU versus is spent domestically is still something less than 10%, I believe.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of the money that European countries raise through tax, they just spend themselves, and EU's not even involved. But I bet that's been growing. And ultimately, the ultimate view, and I don't necessarily oppose this, because sometimes you just got to be all or nothing. The ultimate one would be the United States of Europe, where actually where they have a similar thing to the States, where you've got federal and state, but basically the federal is all powerful in the States. Federal can ultimately tell states what to do, I think.
Yeah.
The president can tell California what to do, or whatever. And that's probably ultimately where they've got to get to. And you've got people like nutters like Guy Verhofstadt, that's what he wants. He's always been an ultra sort of United States of Europe kind of person. But they're not there yet. So they have to tread carefully. And while they're not there, it has to be this sort of quite cooperative, the EU, Brussels cooperating with national governments, cooperating with big like corporations. One way you could describe that is a phrase called corporatism. And so they have to be careful. But I guess they're all constantly jousting.
Corporatopia.
There we are. They're constantly jostling for position and seeing who can get ascendancy over the other one, which is an interesting thing to be an external spectator on.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to say about the Huawei stuff in Germany is that's just occurred to me is one argument going around a few years ago for not swapping out Huawei and trying to sort of find some way of accommodating it was that nobody else is good enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you get rid of Huawei, then who else?
Yeah.
I remember actually quite a lot of the mainstream news coverage was maybe fueled by some of the comments that the operators have been making in a way that that they would, because they didn't want to actually have to do anything. But there were stories like Huawei's the only 5G provider. It's the only real 5G provider in the world. And there was this, I think there was this perception. I mean, we know it's an oligopolistic market because we talk about this quite a lot. And you've really only had 3 big companies after years of consolidation that are able to do the RAN stuff internationally and provide all the products and tick all the boxes, those being Huawei as well as these 2 Nordic companies, Ericsson and Nokia. And I think there was a feeling for a while.
We don't count Samsung in that club yet.
No. I can talk about them in a minute.
Right.
But,
sure.
But Ericsson and Nokia were... I think there was a feeling that over the sort of 20 sort of teens, they'd kind of drop the ball a bit and fallen behind. And
well, they both had their struggles.
They both had their struggles, and Huawei, having been maligned in its early days as like a copycat that came along and ripped off technology,
was then kicking ass.
Was actually, that was a bit of an unfair description of it. I think by the time you got to the sort of 20.
Well, it's got massive R&D spend, doesn't it?
Huge R&D spend. I mean, that's obviously spread over a bigger area.
It's got broader concerns than Nokia.
It's got smartphones, and it's got the whole, unlike Ericsson, it's got fixed and a huge amount of fixed stuff that it does, which Ericsson's not involved in at all.
Yeah.
And unlike Nokia, it's got a smartphone business, and it's even involved in some things that don't have a lot to do with telecom. It seems, if you listen to what some people have to say.
Even now, it's funny to say, unlike Nokia, it's got a smartphone business.
Yeah.
When you consider 15 years ago.
but yeah, their R&D heft is massive, and I think they were generally seen as the most competitive company technologically, and that Ericsson and Nokia just weren't really at the races anymore. And I think that's probably I mean, we'll come on and talk about this actually in a bit with the Nokia stuff we're going to talk about.
We'll get there in a sec.
I think Ericsson did a very good, I mean, for all the things that maybe aren't great at Ericsson at the moment, it's done a very good job, I think, under the current CEO of kind of reclaiming its sort of technological competitiveness that it had lost. And you talk to people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do, who assess products and look at base station and they've all been quite sort of complimentary about its product set in the last few years, and so the argument that we can't fall back on using Ericsson and Nokia because they're not good enough, I think it's quite weak. The concern that they might have, which is more of a current one than what was going on a few years ago, is that if you do use them and you don't have Huawei, you've only got two companies in the mix. And you mentioned ideal. Samsung, and we have this thing called Open RAN, which is a kind of concept about having interfaces that mean you can buy from specialists. Basically, you could just go to a radio company that's never really been allowed to compete before because it doesn't have baseband products, so it's never really sort of fit into the mix very well unless it gets embraced by an Ericsson or Nokia and brought within their portfolio. But the idea is, with Open RAN, if you can have an interface and you can marry that radio company with Nokia's baseband or someone else's baseband, then you give these specialists a leg up, and you give a bit of a spur to competition. And I think it sounds good in principle. I mean, there's all sorts of problems about it working in practice, but Samsung is partly sort of trying to use Open RAN, I think, to sort of buoy itself and get in the mix, but it actually had an offering before then anyway. The main problem with Samsung, and this is not me, this is what people like Howard Watson were saying actually back in the 2019-2020 period, when they were sitting on these parliamentary committees and having to answer questions about why haven't you used Samsung, why isn't that an option, was that it doesn't have support for legacy technologies. They're very much focused on 4G and 5G, and companies if you're a greenfield operator, that's fine, but if you're an operator like BT, which is one of the oldest companies in the world in this sector, let's be honest, with all sorts of legacy stuff there in its networks, it still has a 2G network it needs to support, and we'll have to support that for a good few years yet. It still has 3G there, I think. I don't know when they're planning on phasing it out. I think, maybe soon, maybe fairly soon. But,
we went to that event where Howard was talking quite a lot about how we've got to phase this shit out.
But they just didn't have offerings in those areas, Samsung, and that's why that's the main problem for them in coming into Europe, I think, and serving brownfield operators in the European market, is their lack of an ability to support services that customers still use and need. And you see how awkward that is for the telcos. They'd be quite happy, I think, to ditch some of this stuff. But any suggestion they're about to do it, there's a Daily Telegraph story, no, actually not Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail story saying they're cutting off pensioners in the north of England who only have 2G phones. And, it's like... So that's what would happen if they tried to rely on someone like Samsung, essentially. And I think Samsung, in fairness, is trying to do things to address the 2G issue, and that's maybe why they do now feature in Vodafone's network, not very extensively, but the idea is to use them and some other companies to phase out Huawei across a big chunk of the network over the next few years. So this is the thing with Deutsche Telekom, is it's really into Open RAN, it's really invested in it, and it's been doing trials in this place called, I can't remember the actual real name of the town, but they call it Open RAN Town.
That's it, yeah.
Or ORAN Town. They've been doing these trials with companies like Mavenir and NEC and Fujitsu, I think a few others. And they came out with an announcement at Mobile World Congress about using Mavenir for massive MIMO, which is like an advanced 5G technology outside Germany. And inside Germany, they're talking about using a mixture of Fujitsu and Nokia to do some Open RAN stuff. But I think it's only really small scale. It's not like they're saying we'll use that to swap the whole
they are. I
Huawei
mean,
network.
I think I'm pretty sure it was in conversation with you. I was reminded that Vodafone started mucking about with Open RAN quite early, but especially in bits of the West Country and South Wales or something.
Yeah.
And it was pointed out to me that the reason for that wasn't just because they give less of a shit about West Country.
The Welsh.
Yeah. Bloody, I won't notice a bloody difference. Was because that happened to be where there was a bunch of sites that had reached obsolescence and it was time for a change anyway, and they just went, fuck it then, let's give it a go.
Yeah,
there.
as well as it being Huawei, so they have to replace it anyway, and they want to use Open RAN to so their network, as I understand it, based on what they've said, is mainly Ericsson, and Huawei across about a third of it, I think. So, and that's mainly in the West. Now, that if they've not had a great relationship with Nokia, Vodafone UK. They actually swapped out Nokia stuff in London and parts of the southeast.
Is that when Nokia was being shit?
I don't know if it's related to that. I mean, Nokia had its product problems. We can talk about that in a bit. But they did sort of move to replace Nokia with Ericsson, which makes them more heavily reliant on Ericsson, and probably means they're not that enthusiastic about the idea of going back to Nokia. So if they have to sort of swap out Huawei, what are their choices? They either become wholly reliant on Ericsson across the whole network, which nobody wants to do these days. That's totally not in vogue to be a single, to be in a single supplier situation. That's a total opposite to where everybody's moving. These days. So the other choice was to try and take advantage of Open RAN and see what they could do with it. And and Samsung is the main company in that mix, but there are other ones there as well. There's NEC, there's, on the sort of containers as a service platform, there's Wind River, there's Intel chips that are being used, there's the whole sort of batch of players.
Okay, well, let's move into that, Eric, just because I'm aware of time, and you got to do another podcast in a bit. How dare you, sir? Just one last thing I want to mention before we move it on is a story that we wrote about a week ago where we were journalising the FT, where they'd written a story pointing out that Huawei is participating in 11 projects under EU's Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Programme, which runs to 2027 and has a budget of nearly 100 billion euros. And so the poignance of that is just at a time when EU's saying fuck Huawei, they're chucking 100 bill.
Wow.
At projects that Huawei's involved in. I mean, whether Huawei's getting all of that 100 bill, I don't know. But I just as a final, I think it's an interesting point to wrap this up, because this story is actually more about the EU versus member states than it is about Huawei. And it's bloody complicated. There's so many conflicting interests that it's actually quite remarkable when the EU adopts even as strident a position as it did a week or two ago about Huawei, because it knows this is one of the problems. And I have some sympathy, but a really big bureaucracy like this, and especially one like the EU, where they're trying to bring together countries that have been separate and largely at war with each other for 2,000 years and have got about 20 different fucking languages between them. You're always going to have all these trade-offs, and if you do this, then they're going to be pissed off, and so then you got to placate them and all that sort of thing. And yet on top of that, the EU still happily interacting with Huawei in other areas, while at the same time going, we can't be having them. They're too dodgy and Chinese. Anyway,
it's a bit sort of and there's lots of hypocrisy that goes on at this.
Well,
level,
and contradictions,
yeah. And it's one thing I found amusing was. They won't like me for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Go on, son.
When I went to Adastral Park last year on a really shit weather day,
right?
And it's like a sort of old 1970s style university campus, by the way, Adastral Park, even though it's made out to be this high-tech.
I think I've driven past it on holiday in Suffolk.
I mean, there is a lot of high-tech stuff going on there,
but it just doesn't look that whizzy from the outside.
Somewhere that you studied, when you were
or some
at some shit
repurposed World War
university.
II sort of airfield.
Yeah, totally.
That sort of thing.
And they've got. It's the weird thing that maybe people don't know is it's not kind of like just BT people there. It's like opened up to all sorts of other players. It's like startups and mid-sized companies come and share knowledge and get involved. It's like an ecosystem. Lo and behold, one of the buildings in the middle of it all has Huawei's banner above it, and then there's a Huawei speaker sitting in the audience asking questions at the section we were at.
Dull.
And it's like, it's you kind of think.
And so the real thing, I think, and I think I've been pretty consistent on this position, is being absolutist about it just rankles. Firstly, it comes over as sort of borderline xenophobic.
Yeah.
Like China equals bad. We've only decided this in the last 10 years since America decided to pivot away from Russia towards China as its great geostrategic rival.
Yeah.
And then, there's this globalized economy. In fact, this might be a good link onto the next thing because I really should move it along. Just one last thing I wanted to mention. We were talking about ASML, which does this ultraviolet lithography, which is really important to the latest chip manufacturing processes.
Yeah.
I noticed something today where Nikkei Asia and FT in combination.
Don't they own the FT now?
Is it that way around? Right. Well, they're obviously joined at the hip in some way.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Nikkei Asia headline is ASML says decoupling chip supply chain is practically impossible, and that's in reference to global. So decoupling globally. Top equipment maker sources globally while keeping most production in the Netherlands. In other words, this bloke's saying, Christophe Fouquet, who's their EVP and all that, who's been chatting to Nikkei Asia, is just going, look, you can't just fucking decouple this stuff.
Yeah.
The globalization's, the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah.
So that's another area in which, and this isn't without being excessively sympathetic to the Chinese. Like I said, I'd if I ever went to China, I'd be shitting myself going through the airport. But globalization's happened.
It's happened.
We're all just interdependent.
Well, this is the nonsense of Open RAN in a way. This idea that you can have security and resilience and not be reliant on somebody else. Because even with Open RAN, where are all the chips being made?
Yeah,
where are all the foundries now?
Yeah, well, quite. Anyway, let's move it on. So you we've touched on it already, so we don't need to intro. Why don't you have that bottle? You wanted that bottle, didn't you? Shall I?
Have you got a bottle opener?
I've got a bottle opener on my keyring because I'm such a pro.
I was just struggling to get a bottle out of the Yeti, by the way, for people who aren't watching.
And this is the last of Charles from Lynx Sierra Nevadas. Ian fancied it, so here we go.
I remember drinking this stuff quite a lot when I used to live there a long time ago.
Trying to open a bottle carefully. It's not as easy as you'd think. Here you go, mate. Ooh, hello. Right. So Nokia launched a bunch of stuff. I've got to be honest, Nokia, I'm sure it's very important for you. Wasn't the most thrilling launch, just because it's very in the weeds. I mean, what did I do? I sort of wrote a fairly cursory thing on it. I just said Nokia launched a bunch of baseband cards and just pretty much just listed what they launched and what they had to say about it. And we touched on it earlier. They're all named after birds of prey, I hasten to add.
Some radio units as well.
And some radio units. Yeah. So why don't I hand it over to you? One of the reasons I wanted to ask you about it is not just because you're better at this sort of thing than I am, especially a chip side, but you also interviewed a Nokia guy.
I did. Well, I interviewed Mark Atkinson, who's the head of RAN. He was actually on the call that we were both
did the presentation
on, and I did another call with him, and I wrote something up that was actually on a more specific thing. But
go off on that tangent.
I can. I mean, the announcement itself, I'm not surprised you found it a little bit like dreary, because product updates can be quite dull.
It's not their fault.
No, it isn't.
It's just that these are some cards that you slot into a grey box.
There's cards. There's. I mean, I think the story from their perspective, what they would want people like us to go off and write. And the reason that they wanted to get the press involved, and they had like a big sort of day apparently on the 21st. Was that yesterday or the day before? Midweek this week anyway. When the announcement came out, they had a big sort of a big kind of
extravaganza.
I don't know if there was an online thing you could tune into,
some kind of webinar.
I didn't, because we'd already done it all. But there was probably Tommy Wheato on there talking about stuff. I think the reason they wanted to get us involved is that they want to kind of drum in that message that they're back technologically, because they had this awful situation a few years ago, around about 2019, when they really dropped the ball on 5G.
And as you pointed out in some of your writing about it, it wasn't entirely their fault. Part of it was because Intel was being shit at the time as well.
Yeah. I can come on to that, but they had they had some product issues in 2019, basically, and they did stem from Intel, as I understand it, and from what analysts have said.
Intel's been up in mayor for about 5 years, hasn't it?
Well, Intel's long had a problem with keeping up with process node stuff. I mean, that's not just a thing that's affected Nokia; it's just been a general thing, and they've always been a bit wary of talking about it.
And they've had some missteps where they thought they were there, and it
and then I think under Intel's new sort of CEO, Pat Gelsinger, is it?
Yep.
They're trying to get on top of this, and they're now promising they're going to race through several nodes over the next few years, and they've got this roadmap that people are quite kind of like a bit dubious about, maybe given some of the issues they had in the past. But that, as I understand it, the thing that happened a few years ago that upset Nokia was sort of delays on their move to a 10 nanometer process, and they were obviously a big supplier to Nokia at the time, and they were the only company that was actually supplying Nokia for this aspect of the 5G base station.
They were a single supplier dilemma.
It was a single supplier dilemma. It was admitted actually on a call that Rajiv Suri was on with analysts, that they were the only option for them. They didn't have a fallback, so the fallback became using these chips called field programmable gate arrays, which they got from
FPGA.
Xilinx, partly, as I understand it. I mean, then maybe Intel was...
Yeah, Xilinx is known for FPGA. Xilinx has now been bought by Intel's great rival,
AMD. So they got these field programmable gate arrays that were a kind of fallback, really, for them. And we're using those in their 5G equipment instead, because they'd sort of been let down, as they put it, by a major supplier. They never sort of identified Intel.
They're being a bit too discreet for that.
Yeah, but it's clear it was. And the problem with FPGAs is they're quite hard to work with, I think, unless you kind of... I think it's partly lack of familiarity, maybe, with working with. They're really hard to kind of code for, as I understand it. I'm
going to put it in my simplified language. You can tell me if I'm right or not. The appeal, as the name seems to imply, with field programmable, is that it's a bit of silicon that you can alter its sort of primary function when it's already been installed, whereas normal chips, which are called ASICs. Yeah,
application-specific integrated circuits.
So the name there implies application-specific.
They're only ever as good as they are when you first develop them.
Yes. So they're static, whereas FPGAs are supposedly this dynamic thing. Flip side is an FPGA is more expensive.
They're regarded as being more energy inefficient than ASICs.
Right.
And ASICs are incredibly costly to develop, by the way. You need a massive R&D budget to do it well.
I see.
But once they're done well...
Then you can mass produce them.
Then you can mass produce them, and they're more...
Which is the Intel model, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're considered to be better. But they'd fallen back on these FPGAs, and you could actually see it happening when you looked at their earnings reports, that it really kind of chewed into gross margins. And they were obviously having a problem being competitive against...
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if the technology itself was considered to be substandard, but I think there was just probably a pricing issue, because if you're competing against people trying to win market share and being quite aggressive on that, as Ericsson was at the time with its sort of resurgence, their options were to lower prices and then risk going into loss because they had these higher costs.
Get them out the door and just to not lose market share,
or try it, or just basically accept you're going to lose market share. And what happened basically was they did lose some major deals. They never showed up in... But this is back in the days, by the way, before a lot of the kind of pushback in China was happening. China shutting out Scandinavian companies in the way that the Europe's shut out Huawei, and you've seen both Ericsson and Nokia lose quite a bit of market share in China, I think, in subsequent rounds of 5G contracts being awarded.
Especially Nokia's
they've never had a huge amount anyway, but I remember when that first tranche got awarded, Ericsson did quite well. They picked up a big sort of...
And that's another thing, just to give Strandy yet another shout out. Something he pointed out when he was on the pod, and he has on subsequent bits of research he's published. His point about some of the stuff that we do where we tell Chinese companies get the fuck off out of our networks. He's saying we're just catching up with what they've been doing to the rest of the world for ages. And to something, I don't know precisely how accurate it is, but broadly, he's right.
He is. Yeah, he is.
I mean, they've always massively favoured domestic providers.
Of the job.
Almost a token amount.
A token amount. Now, the bit that Ericsson got, though, interestingly, Ericsson had this push where it was like trying to grow its market share in China before a lot of things blew up with Trump and, you know, the sort of anti-Huawei stuff. And they picked up quite a bit of work in that first tranche of 5G contracts, which made a big difference to their earnings.
Yeah, I remember.
And Nokia lost out completely; it didn't win anything.
Whereas Ericsson got like 12% of everything.
Yeah, and then it lost jobs.
Huawei still got about 2/3 of all of it.
It then lost a contract in the US with Verizon, I think, to Samsung, who we were just talking about. By the way, I think the reason Samsung's been able to sort of make inroads in the US in the way that it hasn't in Europe is because companies like Verizon have been more aggressive on phasing out some of these old. You know, they've basically got a 4G network that's more kind of VoLTE based, so able to support voice services. And
I see.
Not having to be as reliant on 2G technology,
legacy,
basically.
right.
But that's a bit of a tangent. But yeah, so Nokia had this. They had these product problems that originated with Intel, and they'd fallen back on these costly FPGAs and then they had this big shake-up. You know, they brought in. They had a change of kind of management at the top, which involved Mark Ruan, who's now head of sort of technology development at Dish, being replaced by Tommy Wito.
Out of the frying pan, Mark.
Yeah, and they had this big shake-up where one of the first things they did was to bring in other chip suppliers alongside Intel, those being Broadcom and Marvell, giving them basically options they didn't have before. You know, moving away from that single supplier reliance and dependency that they had in the past. And they had the big product refresh. They pumped a lot more money into R&D on the mobile side than they had been doing. One thing that you noticed when you looked at earnings reports is that their R&D spending had gone down, you know, at a time when Huawei was spending huge amounts, as we've been saying, and Ericsson was upping its budget. They've been sort of squeezing the amount they were spending. They've been quite distracted, I think, by that whole takeover of Alcatel-Lucent that happened, and, you know, trying to coordinate, you know, what products to get rid of, you know, what bits of the portfolio to keep, how to bring the two sort of separate portfolios together, and all of that. Mm-hmm. And they basically got on top of things, and they had an update a couple of years ago in 2021 where they did very much what they did this last week, and had all these new radios and baseband units on display, and did a big call with the press about it. And I remember talking to people like Gabriel Brown at Heavy Reading about it, and he was like, "Yep, it looks as good as anything you can get in the market." It's, you know, and then all the things that people look at when they view these things, and they came out with some of this data on the call that we were on, is things like weight of the radio unit, and then the stuff we've been talking about, the nanometer measurements in the chips, and things like OBW and IBW, which I'm going to forget what they stand for, but it's basically the bandwidth range that you can support on a radio, and you know, what all these different parameters that you can look at and check off a box, where they just looked. Where previously they'd not been very good, they kind of rediscovered their mojo. And so I think this whole update that they've had this week has been about showing they're still kind of... I completely agree
with it. They're still with it, and they're still maintaining the technological pressure on their competitors. I haven't got your story up.
My story.
What was your particular angle that you picked on?
Well, I had a follow-up call with Mark Atkinson. I didn't really want to write a story just sort of saying
like mine.
Some interest. Well, no, I wasn't saying that, shit. But I didn't want to do a. They've got some more competitive stuff out, and it looks good. And by the way, it's 20% more energy efficient, and it weighs less, and all that. So there were things that, by the way, that I've skirted over now, because I had some interesting stuff to say about the RIC, you know, RAN Intelligent Controller, which I didn't really go into in my follow-up story, and we haven't talked about here, and probably won't have time for it. We could do that on another occasion. But I wanted to get into the whole virtual RAN and Cloud RAN stuff with him a little bit more, because they've...
that was a big thing they went on about at Mobile Congress.
It is. And they're obviously trying to be a player in that area in a more aggressive way, I think, than Ericsson is, certainly when it comes to Open RAN, and on the kind of cloud vRAN side. The interesting thing is they've just taken a really different strategy from Ericsson, and that was kind of what
Can you summarise that?
Yeah, it's complicated. That's getting
I know. That's why I said, can you summarise it?
Yeah, so there's basically the problem with doing virtual RAN being running your compute, your workloads on general purpose equipment, so that you get this separation of hardware and software. The idea being you can take software and put it on general purpose processors,
normal chip like you might have in your computer.
And then realize efficiencies because you can use the same components for other workloads as well, and you can put it all on the same computing platform.
So that's a bit like I remember when I was first trying to get my head around virtualization in a more sort of data center sense a decade or two ago. And that's the thing. You could have like a hard drive that's compartmentalized, or you could have like a blade or one of these components that's in a server, and it could basically be sort of schizophrenic. It can have different personas. 1 minute at a time when it's needed, it can be optimized for this. Another minute, it could be looking at that, or it could be juggling them both because the software's so clever and the compartmentalization is so clever and the virtualization is so clever that you can do all these things. So that's the idea. Is you got this one thing. I mean, a processor is basically an incredibly powerful calculating machine, and you're saying that that can be running at full pelt all the time because at a given time, it can be going full pelt on this, or it can be doing 50-50 this and this.
Yeah.
But with a general purpose processor, it's got the flexibility to do all of these things as long as the software tells it how to do these things properly.
I mean, the advantage of doing it to traditional baseband, we were just talking about ASICs, application-specific integrated circuits. So you develop a product where the software, your radio access network software, works on a specific type of dedicated circuit. It's a bit like Apple's smartphones in a way. It's looking at it that way, where everything's very tightly integrated. And that software is coded to work on these dedicated chips developed at great cost, and they do one thing, those chips. All they're meant to do is run the radio access network software. And the idea with virtualization is to kind of break that apart, and instead of having those costly to develop but very efficient at what they do ASICs, you take the software and you're able to run it on general purpose processors that would be used for all sorts of other things as well, ideally in a radio access network. And if you ask why anybody would want to do this, because I put this question to Tommy Wheato as we're talking about Nokia at Mobile Congress, he was like, well, the real idea is that you get efficiencies from being able to run everything on the same containers as a service platform, basically, and it makes it easier to kind of do things like consolidation of baseband equipment, for instance, maybe as well, like in facilities, and you rely on less equipment. Then you have some server supporting a bigger number of radio sites, where previously it would all be at the site itself, on this sort of dedicated equipment. So that's kind of what virtualization is. The trouble with taking the RAN software and putting it on general purpose processors is that some of the RAN software is really computationally demanding, and it doesn't work very well on general purpose processors. They're general purpose. They're not necessarily meant to do this
by
stuff.
definition.
And so
tailor-made.
So people have been trying to find workarounds to overcome that problem, because if you don't overcome it, you're accepting that your virtualized
and let me just quickly butt in with one thing. There will be enormous pressure from the likes of Intel for the industry to do that, because Intel's business model is basically, and you touched on it earlier, is primarily a manufacturing company. Intel, it's just manufacturing a very high tech thing. But what they really want to be able to do is churn out a shitload of a chip. And this applies not just to Intel, but to Nvidia and AMD and anyone else,
and
Qualcomm,
also
anyone who's in the chip
chip
game. Exactly. A general purpose chip, to pick a random example. And they want to be able to, let's call it, the Intel Xeon or whatever.
Well, that's what their brand is.
I know. It wasn't just a random thing, but I mean, they do have other brands like whatever the ones that are in PC, like this says i5 and all that. Anyway, let's call it a Xeon.
Well, Sapphire Rapids is their latest range of sort of VRAN chips. Sapphire Rapids, Edge Enhanced, I think.
So I mean, they will have multiple chips, but they've got multiple fabs. But their ideal is to produce as few variants of chips as possible, and because we all understand the economics of mass production. You know, like this can that this Hazy Jane is in. If I just had to make it from scratch, if I had to go off, find the aluminium ore, smelt that down, et cetera, it'd be incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
Whereas when you set up a plant that's producing shitloads of these cans, not just for Brewdog, but for Coke and everyone else, then suddenly the cost per unit goes down. And I think the economics are simple even for making chips. Once Intel's got the or TSMC or anyone has got the manufacturing process up and running, and optimize, then they can churn out these very high value things. And then they want to find as many applications in the field for them as possible. And Intel for years did a great job of that, not only making itself almost ubiquitous in PCs as it is in my Dell laptop here, and was in Apple for a long time, but also in servers and other more industrial applications. So that I just sort of butt in because there was a lot of pressure from the Intel side to make this GP.
Well, you come on to one of the issues with general purpose processors, which is that there's one company really that's kind of very dominant in that space, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the issue of this bit of the RAN software stack that's very computationally demanding, and therefore you have to find some kind of workaround, because if you're just going to stick it on a general purpose processor and then that's being compared with customized equipment that's out there in the market still, it isn't going to be as good, basically. And the workarounds that people have come up with are to use accelerators, as they get referred to, which is basically putting in another bit of silicon that's more sort of customized to that task.
Right.
It's like a bit of
a fudge.
It's a bit of a fudge. It's like, let's stick in another thing that can where you offload some of this.
And then you're getting to the point where you're like, well, then what's the point of the general purpose thing?
Well, this is certainly an issue that it becomes arguably a bit less virtualized then. But what you're basically talking about is layer one. There's 3 layers of the RAN software stack, 1, 2, and 3. And layer 1 is the baseband stuff. It's the PHY layer, it sometimes gets referred to. And that's the bit that's really where it's very hard to put that on a general purpose processor, because it just doesn't stack up very well in terms of energy efficiency, basically, if you put it next to sort of an Ericsson ASIC or a Nokia ASIC. So what they've done is use these accelerators, but there's 2 schools of thought on accelerators, and 2 techniques that have emerged to do this. One of them is called look-aside, which is the one that Intel prefers. And what you do there is you keep most of the functions that are within layer 1 actually on the CPU, on the general purpose CPU, and you only move a little bit off onto this extra bit of silicon that you're using.
Right, so you just look aside every now and then. Is that why they call it that?
Well, I don't know if that's where the word comes from, but it's a lot less reliant on this.
So you're just dipping into the external resource occasionally.
It's a lot less reliant on the accelerator, basically. It's a function called forward error correction that's usually sort of offloaded. And the other technique, which is much more kind of dramatic, if you like, is called inline, which involves pretty much running the whole of the layer 1, all of the layer 1 functions on the accelerator, on the other bit of silicon that you're using. And Ericsson is very, very supportive of, when it comes to virtual RAN and cloud RAN, is very, very much in the look-aside camp. Mm-hmm. Which unsurprisingly Intel backs, because it's heavily reliant on the CPU still. Therefore, you need a more powerful CPU in the mix, and that's good for Intel. And Nokia has very much gone down the inline road, where it's working with companies like, well, specifically actually with Marvell, to develop. And the way they do it, by the way, is to develop a card. It's like a card that you plug into a server. So you'd have your x86 server, x86 being the architecture that Intel supports, and you have this accelerator card that Nokia's selling, with the silicon on it from Marvell and the layer 1 software done by Nokia, and you plug that into the server, and that card looks after your layer 1. Whereas the way Intel's doing it these days is to integrate the accelerator more closely with the CPU and not have a separate card at all. So it all runs on the same motherboard, basically, in the server. And there are different schools of thought and different sort of arguments about why you would do this.
So I'm going to have to move it on a sec because we're running out of time, principally because I know you're on a time pressure. Don't know if you want to let the person that you've got to speak to in 15 minutes know that you might be a bit late.
I will in a bit.
Because I'm happy to go on for a bit, although not for much longer than about 20 minutes after that.
Yeah.
But I'll move it along.
I can sum up very quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also, is there any way of you making a call as to whether it's possible to know which of those is better?
I mean, from a couple of analysts I've spoken to, people seem to think inline is better for energy efficiency,
right?
Because it's you're putting silicon into the mix that's ARM based for a start. We haven't talked about ARM at all at the moment on this.
No, although incidentally. You were talking about Marvell. I remember learning in a previous life that Intel, about 20, 30 years ago, started dabbling with ARM.
Yeah.
Knowing that ARM is a more energy efficient sort of microarchitecture than x86.
Yeah.
But then just couldn't be bothered in the end.
Well, they're too much invested in their
own thing.
Alternative. Yeah.
And so do you know who they flogged their ARM interests to? Marvell.
Right. Okay.
So there we go.
Yeah. So Marvell's, the companies that tend to back inline actually come from the sort of ARM ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because they see it as a way of getting in, I guess, to that area and being able to kind of...
And there's always been that tension between Intel/x86 and the ARM ecosystem.
And so I think inline does propel ARM in that sense, and it's not necessarily a good thing for Intel because it means you need a less sort of powerful CPU. But the other thing that Mark Atkinson was saying, interestingly, is that if you go further up the stack, the sort of layer 2, 3 stuff that you get, if you're doing look-aside in the way that Intel's pushing it at the moment, where you have a kind of accelerator that's integrated with their CPU, you're very much sort of locked into the x86 ecosystem. Whereas if you're using an accelerator card to do your layer 1 and you can plug it into any server, it gives you an option in the future to actually work with the ARM community.
So it's opener.
Yeah, and there are companies now, if you look at the way the market share is changing in terms of server CPUs, ARM is carving out a market share there, and it's growing, and it's coming through companies actually like AWS with its Graviton chips, which are ARM based. There's a small company called Ampere Computing that I haven't spoken to them directly, but I've spoken to HPE about them because they're working to try and develop a server that will be for the RAN with an ARM based chip essentially that Ampere Computing's developed. ARM, by the way, doesn't do its own chips. Like it does blueprints that other companies work with to build chips, and they're trying to do.
And their independence was spared when the acquisition by Nvidia was blocked.
So the argument of one of the arguments of doing this from Nokia's perspective is that it means you have less lock into the Intel ecosystem, basically, and that you have an option to work with the one alternative, the architectural alternative there is really, and to do things
makes sense.
which I think is really interesting.
And this has been a thing that you were very early on, and you've been very coherent on from the start, which is what's the point of Open RAN if you still have a vendor bottleneck at some stage.
And the other big takeaway from this, just to finish off on it, is why is all this important? Because it probably sounds very arcane to a lot of people. Well,
it is.
To have two companies that are two of the biggest RAN vendors in the world, and they are actually at the moment, if you cut out Huawei, taking very different positions on a technology like Cloud RAN, vRAN's nowhere at the moment, let's be honest, it's a little percentage in the market. But if it becomes a big thing in the future, as people are saying it could be, and these guys have gone down very different roads, and it affects so many people in the value chain. You're talking about all the CAS players that you've been used to working with x86. You're talking about what could Intel lose in this market. Now, for Intel itself, the RAN market's relatively small compared with PCs.
But it's one it would dearly love to be
a power in. So it's quite significant, I think, in terms of the repercussions. And if one player, by the way, has made a bet, and operators go, when this stuff starts to get rolled out, they go, one of these is much better than the other one. Yeah. And by the way, I'm not saying that look-aside is inferior, because who knows? I mean, there's arguments in favour.
But you're saying there could come a time where one of them is clearly
winning, and operators are clearly going behind that. The other one is going to have to make a very costly pivot, basically.
Big time. So, no, I think that's a good point to wrap it up on. One last thing I want to say. I looked up on my laptop while we were chatting. Intel's share price. Intel's share price, the most recent peak was 9th of April 2021 when it was $68.
Yeah.
Today it's $32. So that's painful. To be fair, it sort of bumped along. Its biggest drop-off has been sort of since then. That was a big drop. I mean, That's not really fair because it had fallen off by about $10 by a month after that peak. But anyway, it's basically been fucking up. It seems to be picking up a little bit from its trough around the end of last year and early this year. But yeah, being an Intel shareholder hasn't been much fun. In fact, looking at it, it hasn't been much fun for about 20 years. I mean, it had a peak around the dot-com bubble, but it's bumped along. Like today's price is $32. It was $33 back in 2014. Wow. So you basically just haven't been. There was that peak, but now it's no higher than it was 10 years ago. So that's not ideal, is it?
I think it was the laptop boom of the pandemic.
I mean, I think they've got problems.
Yeah, you might be on something.
And then the Apple Silicon.
Right.
I mean, Intel's got various challenges at the moment, I think, which are to do with their sort of pivot to being a foundry. The challenge from AMD in terms of loss of market share, the ARM stuff. I think there's all sorts of things going on, which is where their share price is a bit depressed. But
there's one. I'll give one shout out before we move on. One journalist who I used to know in my previous life, who's called Charlie Demagen. Sorry, Charlie, if A, you're listening, which is unlikely, and B, I pronounced your surname wrong. He used to write for The Inquirer, and then he created his own site called Semi-Accurate, which was a play on words, partly self-deprecating and partly because he's talking about semiconductors.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's been really elbows deep in especially Intel for a long time. Intel and NVIDIA. And he writes about them a lot. And he was.
Glad you said elbows deep there, and not another bit of the anatomy deep.
Yeah. And anyway, he's been calling out these Intel missteps for a long time. Occasionally, I see him. So he's brilliant on that. But basically, they just keep fucking up.
NVIDIA is the other problem for them, by the way, as well. GPUs, which is actually on this same theme, customized silicon being used in data center environments. NVIDIA,
God, I mean, if you want to compare, why don't I quickly do that before I move on. So that was Intel's share price, which is basically you just don't want to have been anywhere near Intel's shares for about the last 20 years. Let's look at NVIDIA Max. Oh, God, I don't even need to look at Max. Look at 5 year. I mean, 2020, start of 2020, you could buy NVIDIA shares for about $60. Now they're $430.
Yeah.
So
10 years ago, they were $3.
Right.
Oh my God.
Were they?
$3.70. Yeah.
$3. Am I looking at the wrong shit? Oh yeah, that was. Yeah, I said. Yeah, I said 2020. Oh, and you said 10 years ago. Sorry, I lost track. I know, it's amazing, isn't it? And they're just exponential in the last year or so. They had a big peak and then they fell off. They had a big peak in late 21.
The crypto.
Then they fell off.
The crypto. Yeah.
Right. And now they've picked up again with AI, which is a perfect segue, by the way, because that's what I want to talk about in our final segment is AI. So I wrote a story called, are you all right to hang around for a little bit after?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Don't worry, Pierre, I know about your hard cut-off as well. It's only me. I'm the one who hasn't got a life. I've never got a hard cut-off. I wrote a piece called US Moves to Catch Up with Europe on Agreeing Guardrails for AI. And I used one of my favourite little stills. For once, I didn't use my Terminator still. I used HAL from 2001, which I think in some ways is
better.
It's more
classy.
It's more imminent as well. No one thinks that we're going to have humanoid robots killing machines in the
Who directed Terminator? James Cameron?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd go for Stanley Kubrick over James Cameron.
Oh, that was Kubrick. Well, to be honest, I would rather watch Terminator than 2001. Bits of 2001 do drag a bit, don't they?
Yeah, that's true.
But there's
what am I talking about?
There's that. Well, the reason I mention it is because there's that bit towards the end of 2001.
Oh, I don't like the last part. It's rubbish.
Okay, well, just let me fucking finish. Where you've got this, they're on a space station and the whole thing's run by this AI bot called HAL.
Yeah.
And then one time, they realise that HAL's starting to get a bit weird. And HAL overhears them going, maybe we've got to shut this piece of shit down. And then one of them goes on a spacewalk or goes off on a shuttle and wants to come back in. And he just goes, HAL, just let me in. And normally it's not like it's just like a normal computer. It's just a command. It's not a request. But the the really sort of haunting thing about it is it turned from a command to a request because Hal started thinking, well, maybe I don't want you back in, given what I've heard you fucking saying. And in the end, it's got this incredibly exaggeratedly calm voice, and he goes, Hal, can you let me in? And he goes, sorry, Dave, I can't do that.
I'm afraid I can't do that.
I'm afraid I can't do that.
All that stuff's good. No, I was referring to the last bit, the baby in the space sort of section of the film, which is just bizarre.
Yeah. Well, so it's towards the end, maybe the last.
I mean, that's actually the best bit of the film, I think, is the Hal part of the film.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I use Hal, which is basically just a red LED.
Yeah.
And
what does it stand for?
Back then, they were like...
I can't remember. But I bet A is artificial.
I referred to it in a story once, what it stood for. I'm trying to look it up now.
Okay.
While you tell me interesting things about it.
See, if Pierre was better at his job, he'd be young Jamie, wouldn't he? He'd be finding this shit. Are you impressed by how that Joe Rogan's sidekick finds shit quite quickly when they're on the pod?
Heuristically programmed algorithm computer.
That's it.
So there's a P missing. But
okay, so they because otherwise it would be hack.
Yeah, HAL 9000.
Yeah. Anyway, so the reason I mention that is right now what people are more concerned. So we've spoken about AI a few times in the past. There was like Elon Musk and co going, we've got to knock it on the head at GPT-4 because it's all getting a bit scary, which is obviously futile because, you can't hold back the tide and all that sort of thing. But recently I wrote up that, so the reason for my headline about the US moves to catch up with Europe is because Joe Biden had a meeting of people and they all got together and Joe Biden did one of his slightly senior speeches at the end of it.
Oh, God save the Queen.
Yeah, that in a speech recently, isn't he? He was reading from a script. He's not so bad when he's reading from a script. It just gets a bit more dicey when he freelances. But here's a quote. He goes, and basically he got them round because it's all about managing the risks and how do we regulate and how do we manage and how do we put up guardrails? That's per my headline around AI because we might not be having the Terminator soon, but who's to say we couldn't have HAL soon, or who's to say we couldn't have Skynet, which was the precursor of a Terminator, where so much of our stuff is controlled by artificial intelligence that we lose manual control.
All those robot dogs with OpenAI stuff integrated with
them. Those Boston Dynamic fucking Black Mirror
He got asked
jobs.
about it. Sam Altman, the OpenAI guy, he got asked about his work with robotics and he said, well, we wanted to do a lot more of that, but it was quite expensive because you're working with robots, they kind of screw up every now and again. So we just sort of left the robotics side of it. But we're quite keen on seeing it happen.
I bet he was.
Kind of thing.
Well, that's the thing, back to the Intel thing. You get these incentives. Sam Altman just wants more AI everywhere because his incentives are to grow and grow and grow.
Yeah.
And that's where you need, my cliche about me being a free marketeer, but that doesn't mean that you don't have regulation.
Well, I think the other thing about these guys is they don't think about it in the way that we do. They're these big-brained, Stanford geniuses who like to play with software and push it to the limits and do as much as they can with it. Well, why wouldn't you try and do
and they think anyone who just goes, hold on a minute, is being a Luddite.
Totally. It's like telling a tennis player, oh, you shouldn't hit drop shots because it's, it's a bit risky.
Or not risky. I remember once in a tennis game, my brother said that. He just said you shouldn't hit drop shots because he couldn't get to them.
But they want to push the limits in the same way anyone in any other field.
They're always going to want to do it,
and I don't blame them because I'd want to if I was.
I don't blame them, and who are we to be pure Luddites and get in the way of progress?
Yeah,
even though it's futile. But
that's why you need regulators.
Well, that's why you need a balance. And so this is a Biden quote. He goes, someone else probably wrote it for him. In seizing this moment, we need to manage the risks to our society, our economy, our national security. My administration is committed to safeguarding America's rights and safety, from protecting privacy, and that's a big one, to addressing bias and disinformation. That's a bad one. Don't get me fucking started on disinformation. Although that is relevant to the underlying point I want to make. To making sure AI systems are safe before they are released. Safe being one of those really malleable, nebulous words that they use a lot. And then I juxtapose that with our mate from the EU, Margarita Vestager. And they just did, this was about a week ago, they had this, it's so European, they had a trilogue. In Europe, they have trilogues. European Commission, European Parliament, European Council.
You don't hear that word being used very often, do you?
No, it's a very technocratic European Commission kind of thing.
Trilogues.
But they had a trialogue, and she did this little spontaneous video that she put up on Twitter after going, well, I've just had a chat with my mates in the trialogue.
3 shits.
Yeah. But she was saying similar stuff, and Europe's been saying this stuff more than the States. That's why I talked about catching up, other than just to annoy Americans, because they like, anytime you tell them they're behind, it gets on their tits.
Yeah.
But the thing that's interesting about it, and the reason I want to readdress AI in this context, is what they're really focusing on isn't so much the Terminator stuff, but just the things like privacy. And then Biden goes and talks about disinformation. And so the thing I really want to chuck out there is, I'm pleased they're talking about privacy, because you can imagine more like, China, or at least it's been reported that China has this social credit system whereby you've just constantly got this credit and debit against your name, against your identity. And if you've been bad, then you get certain things taken away from you. And if you've been good, you get certain privileges granted to you. And it's all controlled, presumably ultimately, by Xi Jinping or the Communist Party or whatever. And I think we can all agree that's a fucked up dystopian state of affairs.
Yeah.
No one wants to live in that society, partly because my ultimate one when it comes to power is who decides.
Yeah.
People, sometimes when people talk about power, they talk about it as a nebulous thing. They're like, well, but bad things shouldn't be allowed and good things should be encouraged. But allowed by who? Encouraged by who? It always comes down to who. The power is always going to reside in the hands of a human being, or maybe ultimately in the real dystopia in the hands of some kind of AI. But whenever you concentrate power, or whenever you increase the amount of power over the individual by some central force, you're creating this greater ability to create things like social credit systems. And so I think that's what Vestager, she talks a lot about privacy and all that. And I actually think Vestager, I've heard that she's a bit of an old school lefty. By old school, I mean that she actually does believe in protecting the normal person.
Yeah.
As opposed to the contemporary lefty, who's just this more Guy Verhofstadt compulsive collectivist, where everyone should actually be subservient to the collective, to the party or whatever.
I mean, being on that call, that going back to Timotheus Hertges and the panel that he was on, being on that when I listened into it, the stuff he talked about that wasn't to do with Huawei, made me realise why we need regulators.
Right.
Because he basically whinged about the fact that in America you can go off and do things with AI and not have to worry about this forthcoming AI law and GDPR, and why don't we just seize advantage of these technologies a bit more rather than worrying about them as much.
So I got the impression he had a general vibe of America's a better place to do business than Europe.
That was his broader theme, is that it's better for entrepreneurs.
Was it in your piece where someone asked him, why don't you fucking move there then? Or was that another thing I was thinking of? Right.
Yeah. yeah. And he didn't really have a very good answer to that. But I just think this suggestion, I mean, to hear a CEO, I mean, maybe he's got a point here. Maybe you can be too cautious and you can go too much one way. But to hear a CEO of a company that's cut a huge amount of jobs, by the way, in the last few years, and he was talking about how many jobs have gone in Telecom, was one of his themes.
Which is assisted by AI.
Going on about why do we worry so much about AI regulation and they don't in America, and therefore I want to spend most of my resources there. I think it's a bit worrying, actually. It's a bit scary. I mean, that as a consumer and as an ordinary person, as someone who doesn't move in the same circles that he does, listening to him on that made me think. I mean, I'm sure people from Deutsche Bank and all that lot they're all sort of applauding his comments, but I think any ordinary person listening to that would be like, well, actually, I want regulators to be involved. I don't want AI sort of.
A more imminent dystopia would be something like facial recognition, and I think how much more efficient and more wide-ranging facial recognition, which relies on AI, would be for a social credit system, whereby apparently London's one of the most CCTV intensive places in the whole world. Yeah. So everywhere we go, with AI-driven facial recognition, someone can recognise you unless you've got a fucking mask on.
Yeah.
And they can see, oh, look, there was Scott. There was him crossing the road on a red light. That's a demerit for him.
Yeah.
There was him drinking a tin, walking down the road. There's a demerit for him. Not that I'd ever do such a
Have you seen the new Black Mirror stuff?
No, my son was watching it, and we've only got a one account on Netflix. We've gone for the tight-ass Netflix account.
Well, I haven't seen it either, but I saw the advert for it. As you go on Netflix and it comes up, there's a guy at an airport where when he goes through the passport control, they go, show us the last 24 hours of your life, which has been filmed on his smartphone and from sensors around him. And he has to sort of show them what he's been doing. And if
that's he's
the only
been
thing
bad.
I've seen. And it's like, I'm guessing if you've been bad, then you're not allowed to sort of board the flight or something is the implication.
And that comes back to the power, because who decides what's good and bad?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you and I, you remember, like, during the lockdown.
Wouldn't it be a long process though, to review that?
No, because they speed it up. They look at it in
and they
fast
compress
forward.
it. And that's another thing.
And they're able to
that's another thing, Pierre, where AI would come in, because what AI would do is it would just look for certain tells.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can see that sort of going on in the clip.
Yeah.
But I haven't watched them yet. But,
it would just look for certain tells, like most of the time where you're just sitting around picking your nose.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that would be a demerit. Fuck knows.
I don't,
A demerit. It's a minus for you.
It is. That's how
I've resisted watching a lot of Black Mirror because I do find it quite depressing, to be honest with you. I mean, I can be quite a sort of miserable person.
It
some
just
better times.
tips you over the edge.
Yeah.
But anyway, but you know, it's a good point you bring up, Pierre, because with more powerful AI and more powerful processing, becomes the ability to process more amounts of video, and then form conclusions from it. And then another problem with AI is what you put in. Like one thing that's come up, and I've mentioned this on the previous pod, with ChatGPT, if you know, none of us are famous enough for the internet to have a strong position on us either way. But let's say we were. Let's say, Pierre, you know, you're in another life were a film star or musician. I know you're a quite handy musician, aren't you? Let's say you're a musician. It's not too big a jump. And so there was lots of stuff on the internet about you. There'd been Wikipedia articles, there'd been interviews, all that sort of thing. And then someone said to ChatGPT, you know, summarize Pierre's life in 500 words. That the way in which ChatGPT went about it would still be algorithmically biased. There's no escaping it, because it still has to be programmed by a human being. And it might be biased towards finding that one time where you were caught doing coke off a hooker in a bog, and then define, this is your previous rock and roll life, obviously.
Where I landed on the moon.
And then define you all by that one most heinous, most out of order act that you did. Anyway, the point is, where the more AI is basically just a concentration of electronic computational power, and it can be skewed one way or the other. So I'm pleased to hear people like Vestager saying it's important to keep an eye on this shit. The flip side is, as Biden sort of alluded to, and I'd forgotten he'd said this in his quote until I read it out just now, where he goes,
God save the Queen.
That was a thing recently. Where he goes from protecting privacy, good, to addressing bias and disinformation. So he wants the US government to be able to have a role in determining what the AI considers to be disinformation. Now, disinformation, we know, is a very vague, nebulous, woolly term. You know, we've got a guy who's doing quite well politically in the States right now called RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And he comes up with some wacky stuff.
He's not really junior, though, is he?
Well, he's quite old, but he's younger than his dad.
Yeah.
Wi-Fi is bad for you.
Yeah. So there's one thing he came out with on that Rogan
He's
thing.
69 years old.
He's 69 years old.
He's
Wi-Fi.
He's a youngster compared to the two main contenders.
Yeah, well, it's spring chicken, isn't he?
No, the Wi-Fi thing, I was just, oh my God.
Yeah, well, so Ian, Pierre and I both listened to him on Rogan, and he says some wacky stuff like,
I'm really disappointed with how
he's in
Rogan
pretty good
barely
shape,
pushed
isn't he,
back
for a
on
69-year-old?
Well, Rogan doesn't really push. Well, he sometimes does.
Come on. He was like the Wi-Fi thing. He's like skeptical at first.
He was very
And then
credulous.
Jamie pulls up one article. He goes, oh my God. Like, come on.
He looks in good shape for a 69-year-old.
He looks in very good shape for a 69-year-old.
I was looking at him, I was thinking, bloody hell, he looks like he's like running 20 miles a day or something.
No, he's looked after himself.
Yeah. He obviously doesn't do a lot of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale.
One wacky thing he did say is that it gives you like ear cancer and makes your brain go weird. And the thing is, I mean, I don't know. He's probably looked into it more than I have, but I'm pretty sure. I remember looking into some of this stuff. Do you remember when people were talking about how 5G gives you coronavirus and shit?
Yeah.
Now,
I think he's into that too.
Probably. See, this
Not for coronavirus, but like...
He's into some out there stuff. Some of his stuff is spot on. Like some of the stuff where he talks about the corruption of pharmaceutical industry seems spot on.
Yeah.
Medical industry complex.
Yeah, all that stuff. But then he just goes off the deep end with some other stuff. But anyway, fair enough. You got to take the rough with the smooth. But yeah, the Wi-Fi one, I mean, my understanding is that end of this is relevant to our day job, that end of the electromagnetic spectrum, the very low frequency end, is the least ionizing, the least cancer causing.
Yeah.
So
it's when you go for a CT scan that you've got to worry.
Yeah, or an X-ray.
You don't want to be
like
out there for 24 hours as you come out sort of glowing.
Yeah. God, we said glowing at the same time and laughed at the same time. We've always been podding together for too long. Anyway, why did I mention him? What was I just going on about?
AI.
Oh yeah,
the fact that GPT picks its source of data.
Yeah, so someone like him, he's considered by like the establishment to be out there, and so AI would probably stigmatize him, whether it's writing about him or maybe looking for this podcast, where this podcast would be fine until the AI picked us up talking about RFK Jr. and maybe detecting that we weren't critical enough about him.
Yeah.
So this is the real thing they're talking about. But what I question on both the part of Biden. So, that was disinformation. That's what got me onto that. So he's generally he's dismissed as a disinformation. And Pierre's right. Some of his shit does sound just wacky. But that doesn't mean that all his shit is.
Like, I'm sure, like, if you try to look for an article on how, I don't know, ketchup causes cancer, you can probably find a bunch.
Yeah. It's probably written by him.
Yeah, you could find anything. And it seems like, anyway.
Exactly. And we all wrestle with that because I find myself naturally attracted towards things that are contradictory to the mainstream narrative, but I have to discipline myself and not go get down every rabbit hole because some of it's bollocks. A lot of it is. Anyway, and if you listen to shit like Rogan, you're going to hear a lot of that, aren't you? Because you'll get these people who've been dancing with aliens and stuff on.
Yeah, but that's fun. The alien, that's kind of fun. Yeah,
that's sort of a bit tongue-in-cheek,
isn't
it's
it? Funny.
Except recently, now that some blokes come out reckon that we are dancing with aliens. Anyway, that's another thing. But my flip side is I worry that the likes of Biden and Vestager actually just want to control it. And in the name of regulation, this is the really dicey thing about regulation. In the name of regulation, what they really mean is we don't want to regulate it. We just want to make sure it's consistent with our objectives. Now, and there's some form on this. Like if you look at some of the stuff that's been going with social media, and I've banged on about it in the past, talking about Twitter and the Twitter files and all that sort of thing, it's clear that governments want to be able to control social media such that only the stuff they approve of is permitted on social media and stuff they disapprove of isn't. A great example of that is things like the Hunter Biden laptop thing, which was basically censored off all social media and has now turned out to be all right. Or even better one is the origins of the coronavirus. For about a couple of years, if you said it came from that lab in Wuhan, you got kicked off social media. Yeah. Now everyone pretty much accepts that it probably was.
Yeah.
So it's this control of information, and they're doing it with social media. They tried to do it with the internet. They've succeeded to some extent. We've got things like I've spoken about years ago, like Parler getting kicked off AWS. But largely the internet, you'll get Reddit or whatever. There are enclaves on the internet where you can find out all kinds of wacky stuff. So they failed in controlling the internet. But I think that's led them to want to make up for lost time, and they want to control social media, which they largely have done until Musk bought Twitter, and now they've got less control over Twitter. And I think they really want to get ahead of the game on AI. So that's a flip side. I concede that it needs regulation, but I worry that regulation will just take the form of government
control,
manipulating it to their ends.
Totally, yeah. So it's just a really awkward one to know how it's going to go, because it's such a big force to unleash on the world. If it goes where it could go, that's the problem.
It's massive amount of power.
It's so disruptive that no one really knows how to deal with it. And on the one hand, you've got this thing in an unregulated world that could just sort of run amok and give people like DT's boss the opportunity to do all sorts of things with the workforce that we don't really want to see happening necessarily. But then if you have the governments weighing in, then it becomes a tool for, a system that you've got in China almost, and a more kind of sophisticated social credit system even. Which in countries like America isn't very good, because America didn't do very well in the Economist's recent democracy rankings, I noticed, which is quite stunning.
No, well, I'm not surprised.
They were ranked as a flawed democracy.
So, because there's things like the Twitter files have revealed this, and other things. There's this incredible overreach by their security agencies.
Yeah.
It seems like the likes of the FBI and the CIA and the HSA and the DHS. I mean, there's so many alphabet.
DHS.
Yeah. The Department of Homeland Security.
Starting to sound like companies that deliver packages.
DHL.
Yeah.
Well, I think DHSS, which used to be our sort of
BHS we had, didn't we?
Yeah.
They did crap clothes.
British Home Stores. But anyway, there's all these alphabet agencies, and there's so many of them. And there's another classic example of bureaucratic creep. 50 years ago plus, when Dwight Eisenhower was talking about the military-industrial complex, the likes of CIA and FBI were nowhere near the size they were now.
Yeah.
That's another thing RFK goes on about, is he reckons the CIA killed his dad and his uncle, his dad being Robert Kennedy, not Jr., and his uncle being JFK, the president.
Yeah.
But now they seem to spend most of their time just trying to spy on Americans.
Yeah.
And
it's good to see the Kennedy dynasty still alive and kicking, though.
Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, Pierre's completely right.
Wipe them out. How many of them you shoot, you still.
Pierre's completely right to point out how wacky a lot of his stuff is. But I naturally find myself drawn towards just disruptors and nutters. I mean, to that extent, I still have a bit of a soft spot for Trump, even though I think he's largely a negative force.
Yeah.
But at least he's a disruptor.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just want to flip over the board and go, fuck it, because you just see so much bollocks going on.
Totally.
Anyway, you've got stuff to do, and I think we've naturally done that one, and Pierre's got to go in a minute. So I think we'll wrap it up there, and we'll just say again, thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.